All right. Hello, everybody. I know people are still kind of filing in, but we will go ahead and get started. We have so much to cover tonight. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming tonight to this presentation from the Partnership of Historic Bostons. I am Lori Rogers Stokes, and I will be the moderator this evening for our talk with Adrian Weimer. Glad that you could all make it tonight. Very excited as we start a new year of talks and history programming, and glad to have you joining us. So I will just go over, before I introduce Adrian and we get started, the way our format works, which is I will hand over to Adrian after I introduce her. And then as she's talking, whenever you have a question or comment, put it into the chat. And I will be monitoring that chat the whole time. And I will make sure that every question and comment are relayed to Adrian at the end of her presentation when we turn to Q&A. So even if your comment or question comes very early on, don't worry, it will be included. I don't always go in order, but I will get them all. So just put things in the chat as they occur to you. We will do questions at the end, and we always have a lot of questions, so settle in for a good long experience with Dr. Adrian Weimer, who is a professor of history at Providence College and a long-term fellow at the John Carter Brown Library. And she is the author most recently of the tremendous book, A Constitutional Culture, New England and the Struggle Against Arbitrary Rule in the Restoration Empire, which was awarded the Winthrop Prize. And I should have brought my copy over to the desk here. It is stuffed with Post-it notes and heavily underlined. It's a fascinating topic, so well presented by Adrian, who is going to do the same exact thing for us here tonight. So I will turn over her with no further ado. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Lori and Sarah and Jay and everyone at the Partnership of Historic Bostons. It's great to be with you this evening. I'm always excited to talk about early Boston and constitutionalism. So I want to start by making what I think is a defensible claim, which is that New Englanders in the 17th century had a remarkably robust political culture. And what I mean by that is that politics is about more than personality. It's about more than a quest to gain power for a certain party or interest group. What I think a robust political culture means is the ability of people, and I mean many kinds of people, a broad range of people, to weigh issues, to think about how a policy might affect the well-being of the whole, and to discern when rulers start to go outside the lines, to abuse their legal or constitutional powers. And we're not going to agree with all the decisions these early Bostonians made, but I think it's worth our while to take a few minutes to enter into this 17th century political culture. And it's both because it matters for the American Revolution. It does, it's true. It's also interesting in its own right. And I think also it might perhaps be useful for us in our own time. You see a really nice snapshot of this political culture forming in the Synod of 1679. It's sometimes called the Reforming Synod. And this does not get a lot of airtime, but bear with me. I want to give you a few things about this Reforming Synod in 1679. The model for the Synod is the reform of Hebrew society under the prophets Ezra and Nehemiah. And basically, a bunch of folks get together. The Synod has two jobs. They're supposed to diagnose what's gone wrong with their society and to figure out how to make it better. Only two jobs, but those are pretty big jobs. At first, just the ministers get together, but they decide among themselves that they're not going to take any votes unless lay people, lay representatives of the churches are also present. And so there's a bunch of people without college degrees, ordinary people, farmers, who participate in this synod. The synod moderators say repeatedly that, quote, every member of the synod has full liberty to express their ideas. everybody gets to express their ideas. And as you can imagine, there's a hot debate, just as we would have, about what's gone wrong with society. There's one point, there's a layman, a guy named Ralph Wheelock, who attacks another man personally. And then another guy in the room rebukes Wheelock. He says, "You've spoken falsehoods. You deserve to be laid by your heels," which means put his ankle in shackles. And it's interesting. Wheelock thinks about it that night, and the next morning he walks up to the front right at the start of the Synod meeting, and he owns that he had been in too great a heat, and he asks for forgiveness. So there are other aspects of this political culture that I think are transparent at the Synod. There's broad debate, there's freedom of speech, there's also accountability for a certain level of civil discourse. So the Synod, of course, is going to debate church matters. Most notoriously, if you've heard about the Synod, this is probably what you've heard of. They condemn the wearing of lace. They come down on all those Puritan fashionistas. But they also address some other things that I think are probably more central to their concerns. They address colonists' greed over land. They address their lack of support for education. And these are people who actually do significantly support education, but not enough, according to the Synod. And they address colonists' sins of oppression against the poor. So in positive terms, I think what they're doing in 1679 is articulating a vision for society where people speak charitably toward each other, even when they disagree, when people invest in the next generation through schools and books, and where they put the common good before the personal pursuit of wealth. This is a different kind of society. This is one that for these 17th century New Englanders was worth promoting, and it was worth taking risks to defend. Before you, you have the 1629 Charter of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. It says that the people can write their own laws and elect their own leaders. It's an extraordinary level of liberty that's enshrined in this document. Now, in colonist experience, or their fathers and mothers, the charter has already twice come under attack. By the later 17th century, Bostonians have already lived through two major constitutional crises, one in the 1630s and one in the 1660s. And I'm happy to talk about either one. Today, we're in the 1680s. This is the third major local constitutional crisis, and the charter is most seriously at risk. Bostonians know. They know by the early 1680s that this crisis is going to be the worst one yet. The King, Charles II, is trying to rule without Parliament. He's siphoning off power from local communities to the crown. This happens all across England, other dominions, also, across the colonies. He's working to undermine the Charter of London, which allows the city free elections, and for, they're able to elect their own municipal leaders. And there's a quote in italics at the top of this slide that gives us a sense of the magnitude of the crisis, of how a Bostonian might have felt when he contemplates Londoners being forced to part with their liberties through undermining the Charter of London. And this colonist wonders, what shall we poor shrubs expect when the stately cedars crack? We Boston, we're just a shrub. If London goes, what hope do we have? So there's a real fear here about the charter, about the continuation of charter liberties, most importantly, the right to elect their own leaders. What they've seen is that by the late 1670s, there's anti-Puritans, a series of royalists who are in the colonies gathering evidence against primarily Massachusetts Bay, but also Connecticut. And these royal officials are writing all these documents, you can read them, which highlight colonists' seditious, evil practices, like coining their own money, that they won't take unconditional oaths to the crown. They'll take certain kinds of oaths, but not the unconditional kind that say total non-resistance. The anti-Puritan royal officials are also gathering evidence about the Navigation Acts, and colonists are, to be honest, not very good about following the Navigation Acts. They'll trade with the Dutch, they'll trade with the French, and colonists are not paying enough customs duties. So all of this amounts to a case against the charter about colonists' right to have self-government. By 1683, back in London, the Committee for Trade and Plantations has started to legally undermine the charter. They've issued what's called a quo warranto proceeding, which is an attempt to legally dissolve the charter as a prelude to installing an unelected, royally appointed governor. So this is where things start to get really heated. Charles II goes to the leaders of the Bay Colony and he says, you have to voluntarily give me your charter. You have to resign it. You have to give it up. And he actually goes so far as to put enormous pressure on the current slate of elected leaders in Boston. He says, if you hold on to your charter and you contest this quo warranto in court, you are personally going to have to pay all the fees associated with the legal battle. So this is their family's savings. I mean, none of these guys are wealthy, but this is their estates. This is them personally accountable if the legal contest against the quo warranto fails. You know, if you were walking down the streets of Boston or Hartford or Ipswich, this is all anybody's talking about, right? There's an extraordinary colony-wide debate over whether they should voluntarily submit the charter, because, you know, maybe the king will be more inclined to have mercy, or, you know, that's the alternative argument. There's advice coming in from all over the place, not just from people across the colony, but also from reformers in England and Scotland and the Netherlands. People are weighing in about what's the right thing to do in this situation. By December of 1683, the issue comes to a vote before the Massachusetts General Court, and nobody knows what's going to happen. Right? Will these leaders put their own private interest above that of the colony? Will they be willing to risk their lives and livelihoods in defying the king? Astonishingly, they vote to stand strong. They vote to hold on to their charter. And again, this means their families' estates could be wiped out in legal fees. Connecticut leaders do the same. And then, in an extraordinary meeting in January of 1684, the freemen, or the voters of Boston, meet to debate the issue. And I think the reason they're meeting is because they're also going to put their names to a document which says they stand with their leaders. They take the risk along with their elected leaders. And Increase Mather gives a rousing speech about constitutionalism, and the freemen of Boston vote that they will not voluntarily relinquish their liberties. Okay, as we know, the quo warranto fails on a technicality, but the Crown ingeniously finds another legal instrument to yank the charter anyway. It also vacates the charters of Connecticut and Rhode Island. And then there's a few years of just really desperate uncertainty. People don't know what's going to happen. Finally, in December of 1686, the new royal governor, Edmund Andros, arrives. He sails in on a royal frigate, a warship, with 100 redcoats, professional soldiers. The king, and now it's James II, has authorized Andros to dissolve local governments. He is supposed to create a new super colony called the Dominion of New England, which stretches from New Jersey to Maine. And in this dominion, there will be no locally elected leaders. There will be Andros and Crown appointed councils. You know, Andros is a really interesting guy. He's a royalist through and through. His father was actually master of ceremonies for Charles I. That's a serious royalist family. The father fought on the royalist side of the civil wars in the 1640s against the parliamentary armies. At the age of 19, Edmund joins a cavalry troop and serves in various wars in Europe and the West Indies. He marries a very wealthy, well-placed woman, Mary Craven, who's the cousin of an earl, and for his service and also this marriage, he gains 50,000 acres of land in Carolina, right? So he's one of these proprietors of Carolina, or at least a big landowner in Carolina. Just prior to the time we're talking about in the 1680s, he's governor of New York. And to be fair, he's a competent administrator, right? He rules in New York, however, with an appointed council. There's no elected leadership in New York under the reign of Andros. As a thoroughgoing royalist, he also believes that the purpose of the colonies is to serve the interests of the crown. I can imagine what Bostonians are feeling like with the arrival of Andros and the beginning of the Dominion of New England. I think a lot of them are in shock. They just can't believe that the society they built has crumbled so quickly. One of these leaders is a guy named Edward Rosson, and I think he felt the loss of an elected government especially keenly. Edward and his wife Rachel had sailed to Massachusetts Bay from England with a toddler, a little boy, back in 1637 to escape the anti-Puritan legislation of Charles I. The Rosson family would grow with the colony. They had 11 more children. Take a moment to process that. Edward probably had some legal training back in London, from what we can tell. At the age of 23, his neighbors in Newbury, up in the North Shore, elect him the youngest member of the General Court. He also later helps to revise the colony's law code. I feel like I've spent a lot of time in my life with Rosson because he's the colony secretary and his scribbles are everywhere. He's a Puritan. His uncle was John Wilson, the prominent Boston minister. He and Rachel joined the First Church of Boston, which is John Wilson's church, though Wilson sadly dies soon afterwards. Edward Rosson was also a moderate. He's a guy who values charter liberties as much as anyone, but actually in the constitutional crisis of the 1660s, he had urged limited compromise with the crown rather than open defiance. Rosson supported the Synod of 1679. His pastor at that time, James Allen, had actually been a moderator of the Synod. And I think it's fair to say Rosson shared this vision of society. It was the kind of society that was articulated at the Synod, charitableness to enemies, support for education. He supports this kind of society. It's the kind of place that he wants his children and grandchildren to live in. So for Rosson, the constitutional crisis of the 1680s is not just about tearing down the royalists, right? It's not just about one-upping his political enemies. It's about building something valuable. So in this moment, when Andros comes and dissolves the government Rosson has been elected to lead, he has to rethink what it even means to be a representative of the people in this moment. Rosson doesn't want his sons and grandsons to die under the guns of English warships, one of which is stationed at this moment in Boston Harbor. So it's a very difficult time. In public, Rosson and the other elected members of the General Court obey the king. They actually sing a psalm of lament. I would have loved to heard that. And then they go home. And they allow Andros peacefully to assume power. But in reality, they simply go underground and they form a shadow government. They wait and see what the next steps are going to be. And one of the first things Rosson and the shadow government do is they quickly draft this really interesting statement of constitutional protest. So I want to show you some of the language of this document. It's in Rosson's writing, but lots of people who are elected leaders are the authors of this statement. We can see first that there is no certain determinate rule for your administration of justice. They're speaking to Andros. That which is seems to be too arbitrary. Okay, so what they're saying here is that your power doesn't have clear lines. We don't understand what the limits of your power are. The commission that the king has given you doesn't clearly enough tell us how you're going to be held accountable, how your power is bounded. So arbitrary simply means unbounded rule. So your power, they say to Andros, is too arbitrary. Secondly, he says the subjects, meaning the colonists, the Bay colonists, are abridged of their liberty as Englishmen, both in the matter of legislation and taxes, there being not the least mention of an assembly, meaning an elected assembly, in the commission. So, this is no taxation without representation and no law without representation. He says, your council is a royally appointed council. They're not an assembly. They're not anything that we would recognize as an assembly because they're not elected by the people. Therefore, they do not have the right to tax or write laws. And then he concludes, therefore, we think it highly concerns you to consider whether such a commission be safe, either for you or us. And I always wonder about that last line, if there's a little bit of a threat there. I'm undecided on that. So Rosson and the other elected leaders, now shadow government, take this constitutional protest that we just read to Andros. He reads it and he says, libel. This is libel. And Andros actually demands Rosson personally appear before him. And we don't know exactly what happened in that room, but this is how I imagine it. I think he stands before the council and he just looks at him and they rebuke him. They dress him down verbally. And he just stands there. Maybe he tries to make an argument based on the declaration. I don't know. But they let him go. And I think probably what happens is they're not prepared in that moment to make a martyr of him. A couple weeks passes though, and then Andros's council do go back to Rosson and they demand of him the colony's records. And in many ways, this is Rosson's life's work. And this is where things get fascinating. Rosson won't hand the colony's records over. At least not immediately. And I'm wondering what's going on inside his head. I mean, maybe he doesn't want to acknowledge the full legitimacy of Andros's regime. Maybe he doesn't want to make their job any easier. Maybe he thinks they'll use the records to prosecute individual elected leaders. These people are his friends. But what we know for sure is that almost a year later, Rosson still has the records. He would not turn them over voluntarily. And eventually the Dominion leaders, Andros's council, have to come and fetch them, they say, out of his house. So they finally do get the records. In the big picture, the Dominion government exercises near unlimited power at a dizzying speed. Andros raises taxes without the people's consent. He calls each family's property ownership into question. He makes them pay to reconfirm their land titles, along with all these other fees and taxes. He makes them pay quit rents on their land, and acknowledgement that all the land that he says is ultimately the king's. And perhaps most significantly, he reorganizes local militias, the training bands, and he makes sure that the officers of those militias are personally loyal to him. I mean, most of you know a lot about early New England. This is an undoing of New Englanders' entire constitutional framework. And I wonder if people are thinking, Andros seems the opposite of the ideals of the reforming synod. Of course, he's high church and religion, but it's more than that. He seems to think it's normal that government officials profit off of the people, amassing personal wealth. Andros's salary alone is 1,200 pounds. It's a huge, huge salary. Normally, government officials in the early Puritan-led colonies make very little, though sometimes they're given land. Some of the men on Andros's council actually go so far as to start to claim the town commons as their own personal estates. And, like the Boston Common or the Cambridge Common, these are lands that are shared by townspeople. This is a communitarian society. They have shared resources, shared lands, also private property, but they also have, things they hold in common. And it's a place for grazing cattle and other things. Some of Andros's council, they look at this land and they're like, oh, it's available. And they start to seize it. There's this incredible petition from the inhabitants of Cambridge, Massachusetts, that protest the attempted seizure of their commons. And they say this is ours. This is for the people. It is not up for grabs. I think in this moment, New Englanders are bewildered. They never thought they would be governed by outsiders, by these anti-Puritan New Yorkers who have no stake in the local community, who just want to profit off of them. And initially, they're patient, but their patience has limits. One of the earliest signs of rebellion comes when Andros orders each town's inhabitants to choose a tax commissioner, like a tax collector. In August of 1686, the little town of Ipswich calls a town meeting to debate the issue. And they start to ask each other, should we pay taxes to an unelected government? Right? Are we undermining our own principles if we go through with this, if we elect a tax commissioner who then is going to have the authority to collect our rates, our taxes? And lots of people are involved in this debate. And it's another moment when a snapshot of this political culture. And there's a couple of leaders whose names are almost unknown now, right? I'm going to just say them: John Andrews, Robert Kinsman, William Goodhue, Thomas French, and the minister John Wise. They're the leaders, and they take the ideas of their fellow townspeople and they go to Andros and they say, we can't go along with this. It is the privilege of Englishmen not to be taxed without their own consent. Andros says, you have no such privilege. He arrests 30 Ipswich men. He imprisons the leaders. And then during the trial and later, they really start protesting. They talk about the denial of habeas corpus. They talk about the fact that the jury at the trial is packed with New Yorkers. And ultimately, they say these taxes are a violation of the Magna Carta. John Weiss, the minister, famously says, as he's kind of rallying the Ipswich protesters, he says, we have a good God and a good king, and we should do well to stand for our privileges. The jury, of course, pronounces them guilty. The Ipswich leaders are sent back to prison for 3 weeks, and they're fined exorbitant amounts. I have no doubt their fellow townsmen, if they had ended up having to pay, would help them pay. There's actually a similar event in Taunton, in Plymouth. So it's not just Massachusetts Bay that we see these local protests over taxation without representation. I think you see this political culture at work broadly across many different towns in the colonies. And when colonists object to his policies, Andros says, either you're subjects or you're rebels. Black and white. There's no room for negotiation in his regime. There's no room for pleas based on constitutional principles. Okay, as we know, back in England, there is a much larger rebellion brewing against James II. Puritans, or Puritan-Whigs, as many of us are now calling them, play a large role in this rebellion too. And it's actually, we now know that the London Puritan congregations are especially busy during this time. They're secretly raising funds for William and Mary's fleet, which will soon sail from the Netherlands to London and oust James II from the throne in the event called the Glorious Revolution. Back in Boston, there's rumors about what's happening in England. There's rumors that William and Mary have mounted a coup against James II, but there's no certain information. But on the basis of those rumors and also their own constitutional principles and their own frustration with what Andros has been trying to accomplish, they start to get organized. So on the morning of April 18th, 1689, it's actually teenagers who make the first move. They start running up and down the streets of Boston to sound the alarm. Then the militia drummers take up the call and they start rallying the people, and the news spreads from town to town. Initially, you have a crowd of about 100 people. And then the crowd starts to grow, and militiamen from across the region start to gather at 2 points at either end of the town of Boston. From all accounts, within an hour or two, about 5,000 soldiers had organized themselves into 20 militia companies grouped at either end of the town. By 10 a.m., a few of these companies had rowed out to the Royal Frigate, which was in Boston Harbor, and they capture his captain. They capture the captain of the frigate, the royal captain. Next, they surround the castle, which is in Boston Harbor, and then the fort, which is in the south end. On this map, you can see on the south end there, Fort Hill. Nobody knows how this is going to play out. These are militia men who are armed, and they are taking on, a group of redcoats who may have been mixed with colonial soldiers as well. So the royal officers are not about to give up easily. They actually order their soldiers to fire on the colonial militias. So people easily could have died in this moment. But the soldiers refuse. They do not choose to obey their royal officers. And so the colonists, the leaders of the colonists go in and they find Andros. He's hiding in the fort. A delegation finds him and they hand him a declaration. And this is probably the most famous document of the 1689 rebellion. It says, under an absolute and arbitrary commission, Sir Edmund Andros arrived as our governor, who had power with the advice and consent of his council to make laws and raise taxes as he pleased. You see this theme of arbitrariness, absolute power, according to his pleasure, rather than according to the law or according to bounded limits on his authority. The declaration goes on to say, but of all our oppressors, we were chiefly squeezed by a crew of abject persons fetched from New York. By these were extraordinary and intolerable fees extorted from everyone upon all occasions, without any rules but those of their own insatiable avarice and beggary. Accordingly, we have been treated with multiplied contradictions to Magna Carta, the rights of which we laid claim unto. And I think, again, this is a constitutional culture at work. This isn't just high-level elites. This is also merchants. This is also ordinary inhabitants of Boston who have put together this declaration and who are willing to stake their lives and livelihoods on these constitutional principles. Andros initially will not hand over the keys to the fort. There's further negotiations that take place. Rosson's involved with many of the other shadow government. When it's very clear to them that Andros is not going to submit, then they imprison him. And, this is an amazing moment. The people of Massachusetts Bay have just imprisoned a royal governor. This is a revolution. And as in England, the revolution of 1689 is relatively peaceful, right? In the end, no real shots are fired, but it's an astonishing moment of risk when people sacrifice for what they understand as the society they've built, a society on a principle of elected government. Now, I'm just going to take a moment to say, of course, the story is more complicated. I've given you a lot of the exciting parts, but anti-Catholicism plays a role. Fear of a French native uprising plays a role. There's apocalyptic language. There's lots more to say about this, and I'm happy to talk about any of that in the Q&A. But I want to conclude by talking about the year or two just after the revolt, because it's one thing to rebel. It's another to defend the rebellion and to hold on to it. So, New Englanders have a lot of enemies back in England, and they hear news of this April 1689 revolt. And these enemies leap at the chance to call the colonists enemies to monarchy. They're just like those people on the parliamentary side of the English Civil War. These are people we cannot trust to be loyal to the monarchy. They should never have had a charter in the first place. You could just hear the kind of anti-colonist rhetoric that's circulating in London at the time. And Rosson again takes up his pen. He says in this pamphlet called Revolution in New England Justified that the royalist doctrine of non-resistance is indefensible. He says, you say that kings can't be held accountable, or royal governors like Andros can't be held accountable to the people. We say otherwise. This is his language. He says, royalists tried to make the world believe that the people of New England have been guilty of wicked rebellion by their casting off the arbitrary power of those ill men who invaded liberty and property to such an intolerable degree. But the new king and queen, William and Mary, have no subjects more cordially and zealously devoted. Rosson says, the scripture speaks of a lawful and good rebellion as well as unlawful. We have not so much resisted the ordinance of God as we have resisted an intolerable violation of his ordinance. And, this is technical theological language. What he's doing is evoking a tradition of resistance theory, which, was articulated by John Calvin, also by Luther, also by Catholic canon lawyers. This is a long tradition which says that if rulers are really trying to undermine the people's welfare, that people have not only a right, but a duty to resist. Colonist political culture includes an enormous sense of obligation to uphold the common good, not only for themselves, but also to pass on liberties to the next generation, even if it entails great personal sacrifice. The story of April 1689 was well known at the time of the American Revolution. If you go up to, Sam Adams or Thomas Jefferson, these people, they know the story. Even outside of New England, these stories are well known. In part, they're well known because the pamphlets of the 1680s in New England are reprinted at the time of the American Revolution. So you have on your screen the 1773 edition of the Revolution in New England Justified, Rosson and Sewell's pamphlet. Colonial New Englanders are far from perfect, but they did indeed pass down a robust political culture to their descendants. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Adrian. Wow, so much incredible information that I'm afraid very few of us ever learn about. I certainly never learned about any of this in my general schooling. So thank you. And we've got a lot of comments and questions. And one of the first ones that came in was someone asking, how close were these votes, in the 1660s to defend the charter, to say we're not going to give the charter up, which I think gets at the heart of one of the big questions here, which is, where did this political culture come from? How did this end up happening in the Massachusetts Bay Colony and perhaps in the Connecticut colonies? Was it something that everyone would have voted for unanimously, no question? Or were those votes a little closer?
Yeah, it's a great question. Was the question about the 1660s or the
Yes.
1680s?
The original decision not to give in to the quo warranto.
Oh, right. Yeah. So I haven't seen a document which has the numbers for the vote, so I can't tell you precise numbers. But from what we understand, I know the vote of the Boston Town Meeting to back their elected leaders in January of 1684, that's unanimous. And it says so in the document. As far as where did the political culture come from? I think it's in a lot of ways the places you would expect. These are, lots of people participate in the town meetings. They practice these kind of debates. They practice articulating positions, ideas, making civic arguments. And, there's, I think, taught in the schools. There's a big debate today about how we teach civics, and I care a lot about that. But the way New Englanders would have talked about it, I mean, the language is a little bit antiquated, but they talk about the virtue of public spiritedness. That's what they call it, public spiritedness. And I think this is really very much a part of what's taught to young people. Public spiritedness simply means paying attention to what makes a society healthy or sick, and then making resolutions about what your own contribution is going to be. And this is nurtured in schools and churches, also passed on in families from grandparents to grandchildren. So yeah, I think it's we need a lot more work on this. I actually think we need a lot more work on this question of how these political skills, this political culture is passed down.
Well, I'm going to just swing the question right back at you again. Was someone asking, so in England, people all had representation and the opportunity to consent? I see you saying no. So again, we ask, then how did these English people who came to Massachusetts, what became Massachusetts without that, develop it so quickly? And what was the situation in England to get to that question?
Right. So yeah, many more people have a political say in New England than do in England at the time. Though, there's certain boroughs and places that have corporate charters, which is it's a municipal charter, which means the franchise is generally shared more broadly. So it really depends on where in England you are. But I will say, I mean, one of the main things about the Puritan movement is that these are people who are willing to call out injustice. And so I think these political sensibilities are nurtured within Puritan congregations. And Puritans aren't the only ones who have political sensibilities. There's lots of people who do. Lots of people fight on the parliamentary side of the Civil Wars in the 1640s. But I think, Puritan churches are certainly one place where the idea is that your opinions matter. You actually have an obligation. William Ames says this, Thomas Cartwright says this, that you have an obligation to evaluate what's going on in your society and whether it's healthy or whether it's not. There's lots of royalists and anti-Puritans who are going to say, if you don't have a certain level in society, if you're not a member of the nobility or the upper class, keep your mouth shut. We don't care about your opinions. And they say that. I mean, they're open about that. In Virginia, the governor of Virginia says that. He says, we don't need your opinions. It's not the case in New England. It's a very strange place in some ways in the 17th century that ordinary people's opinions are valued.
Yes, that Massachusetts charter, which was not supposed to make any laws repugnant to the laws of England, did one thing by extending that franchise. And so they were not going to want to hand that back over to people who are going to undo that. I'm looking at some questions here. You touched on this. Want to make it clear, did the people in Boston know on April 18th, it's funny, it's that same date as it was in 1775 almost, that James II was out and William and Mary were in, or were they hoping that was the case? Like, when would they actually find out? And, was it a huge risk, or did they feel pretty sure?
Mm. I don't actually know the answer to that question. It's a terrific question, and I've been trying to find that out myself. So the new scholarship on the English side, and this is Mark Goldie's work and others, his work on Puritan Whigs, shows how significant the role of the Puritan nobility, but also Puritan churches and fundraising was in the Glorious Revolution, in actually funding William and Mary's fleet. So that's pretty new scholarship. And that makes me think that if that kind of fundraising is going on, that people in New England might have had more information, but I don't have manuscripts for that. I don't know for sure. And in a way, it's not something you're going to rate. I mean, there's royal censors all over the place, and especially with the Dominion regime in New England. So it's not something you're going to write in a letter. You've got to be pretty careful about those things in a time of crisis. We know that they had rumors. Certainly they hoped, though, it's a more complicated thing with James II because there's certain people who thought that there was still room for a compromise with him. But yeah, all we know is that they had rumors. I think they came from Barbados, but they were not certain or secure.
Andros, you say, had been the administrator in what we now call New York, and that he was a competent administrator. Someone is writing to say, was he the source, though, of the troubles that happened in what is now Southern Vermont, which would have been part of Massachusetts at the time, with people in New York fighting over lands with people in that area?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, Owen Stanwood has done the best work on this at Boston College. He's a terrific book, Empire Reformed. But, the really what part of what's happening there is that he's put New Yorkers in charge of the militias, and then he's sent the militias up to fight what they think is going to be a combined French Wabanaki assault. And all things go wrong. Illness spreads through the camp. There's not enough provisions. There's actually, anyway, there's lots more to that story. I think Rosson probably is directly responsible for those missteps, and then that leads to all kind of additional rumors and conspiracy theories about him being a closet Catholic. And there's a lot of confusing messages on the airways with regard to Rosson. I don't hold him responsible for everything every New Yorker did.
All right, we'll let it go at that. Someone also notes, I'm not sure which thing they are referring to. I missed that, but something was published by several gentlemen. Something, were they anonymous because that was kind of a thing you did in the 18th century, or were they scared about having their names known? So many things will say by a gentleman, or sometimes by a lady. Maybe it was a mix.
I'm going to say a mix. Yeah.
Do you think people in Boston would have known? Or do you think they wondered, like, I wonder who published that?
I think they would know.
Anonymous.
Yeah.
They
I
knew.
mean, yeah,
Okay.
these are small towns. I think people know a lot. But I will say, this the revolt is really started by ordinary people. I don't think people like Rosson are the ones who are starting it. And there's a couple of different sources where they say, and maybe they're covering their own backs, but they say we joined the revolt, the 5,000 militiamen marching on Boston, we in order to keep it from getting out of hand. I kind of believe him. I kind of don't. I mean, I think so. I do think this is a wide scale, a broad scale rebellion. I do think people from across the different strata of society were involved. I think some of those members of the shadow government were probably more involved than they were willing to put their names to afterwards.
I'm going to take something from a question and put it in two parts. First part, what happened? You've got 5,000 maybe armed men in Boston, and then kind of nothing happens. They don't, tear the place up. They don't put in one of their own as the new leader. Like, what actually, they
Yeah.
get Andros in prison, then what happens?
Right. So they agree that the old government from 1686 that was elected in May of 1686 is now going to be in charge. So the shadow government then becomes the people's legitimate government. There is some debate about that. There's maybe other options would have been to have a whole new election, but I think these are people that the townsmen had elected. They're people that are trusted. People like Rosson had a pretty high level of respect, and so I think they felt like that, and they call themselves a committee, but I think they feel like that was the safest option going forward, and there's general consensus among the people. I think they all went to the tavern and had a party. I mean, yeah, I think that's what they did right after.
I'd like to find that document, the tavern bill. So it really may have been a case of, we just want things to go back to the way they were.
Yeah.
So we'll just get rid of the problem, and then we're willing to go back to our towns knowing that our previous government was back in place.
Right. And these people are monarchists. I mean, they don't want a republic. They don't, they're willing to obey the king. They just want the king and his royal officials to have bounded authority. They want them to obey the law.
And that takes it to the second part of this question, where someone says, King William III, when William and Mary are on the throne, did not restore the Massachusetts charter, and they seem to have accepted that and the royally appointed governors that came from it. So why would they accept that, but they didn't accept what happened with Andros in 89?
Yeah, terrific question. So in the wee hours of the morning when it's still dark, Increase Mather sneaks out. He actually has to go on two different little rowboats, and he's got 5 people watching from the rooftops. Do you guys, I hope everyone knows the story. I'm just gonna tell it in case you don't. Um, Increase Mather uh, sails out to a ship. Andros's guys then see him. They send a ship after him, but his little boat is faster. He makes it to the bigger ship that then crosses the ocean. So then he goes and he meets first with James II and then with William and Mary. So it's actually Increase Mather, the Boston minister, who is the one negotiating the charter, not on his own, because the Puritan nobility in England are right there with him, Lord Philip Wharton. And, they're New Englanders are not alone. They're a part of these broader reformed networks. So Increase Mather tries his darndest, and he actually gets a lot in the new charter, but he does not get the freely elected governor. And it's a loss. It's a loss. And he feels that the rest of his life. And I think Bostonians feel that the rest of their lives. But they get a lot. So they do still get an elected assembly.
Yes, which seems like sometimes seems like the bigger win, kind of more surprising
Mm.
win. And again, I think you've pointed out this was pretty unique to New England, not, in Virginia and the other colonies, there were not these expansive charters with constitutional rights for everyone in the same way.
Mhm.
So for him to argue for that may have been confusing for the monarchs. Weren't
Yeah.
hearing it from anybody else.
Yeah. Yeah. In the last book, I was trying to do a little bit of comparison among these constitutional sensibilities in the different colonies. And I was so surprised when I was going through the Virginia records in the 1670s. They actually ask, they say, these liberties that New Englanders have in their charters, couldn't we have some of those too? Like we would like a higher level of liberty. We want higher level of control over our own government. And they get shut down. But yeah, I think other colonies were aware of this. Long Islanders ask over, and of course, no, Long Island is populated by New Englanders, and they ask over and over and again in New York for the same level of liberties that Massachusetts Bay colonists in particular have in their charter, and they don't get it for a long time.
And can you just give a quick definition of what they would have meant by liberties?
Mm. Well, I mean, it's basic political liberties in the sense of the ability to elect their own leaders and write their own laws. They usually couple civil liberties with judicial liberties. So they're also talking about access to the court system, that the laws are written down, they're accessible. There's not huge fees every time you want to accomplish something in court, to petition the government for redress of grievance, those kinds of things. Um, and then they also couple it with ecclesiastical or church liberties, which means that a bishop can't come in and tell them how to worship, that they have control over their own churches, that churches decide the worship, that politicians don't.
Did it also include personal liberties along the lines of what we would think of the Bill of Rights, like protections for individual people?
Yeah, I mean, I think they would have thought about liberty of property. They're not individualists in the same sense. But yeah, I mean, it goes back to the Petition of Right in England, and it certainly leads forward to the Bill of Rights. Um, Yeah, I think so. But I guess I want to emphasize that they're not thinking about individual freedoms. They're really thinking about the freedom of the whole society. And they want freedom to live in what they think of as a virtuous or even pious way. So it's inflected differently than it's gonna be in the 18th century.
Going back to new questions. Again, someone is pointing out that when Rosson and others speak as Englishmen and talk about Magna Carta, they know that this isn't acting in the same way in England as it is in New England. Are they just hoping that they can just call on that, that unwritten culture in England to justify themselves? Or did they really feel like they were moving that forward in New England?
I mean, I think they understood themselves within a very old tradition of what they would have called ancient liberties. And, you can't imprison somebody. A ruler can't imprison somebody without, um, reason. That you can't just take somebody's land. You can't, these are the liberties that are enshrined in the Magna Carta. And so, yeah, I think they're genuine. I think they say we are continuing a tradition of liberty. And again, this is something Puritans in England are doing as well. And not just Puritans. Lots of different people in England have these constitutional sensibilities. The difference in England is that the nobility still own almost all the land and really pull the strings of what happens in government. And so New England, again, is a remarkable place because there's really no nobility. It's mostly middling folks.
We have two questions that talk about Indigenous people. So one is, you touched on this, but a little more on how were Indian wars and the threat of Indian wars used in the conflict with Andros by both sides?
Mm. Yeah, it's a terrific question. So, this the I think we actually still need a whole lot more work on this. As I've actually been looking through these documents for a new project that I'm working on, trying to figure out how Indigenous diplomacy worked, and both in local and imperial contexts. And I mean, it's absolutely fascinating. I think we probably have enough evidence now to say that the French were arming some of the northern New England tribes, the Wabanaki and others. We certainly know there's Jesuit missions up in what we think of as Maine. So there was a lot more going on than we realized. Also, there's conspiracy theories, and there's talk about these New Yorkers actually being Roman Catholics, and then that gets mixed in with the Jesuits who are running a mission among the Wabanaki, and then it's Antichrist who's coming to destroy everything. So that's there too. Was there a military threat? Probably. Was there also a whole lot of conspiracy and rumor? Yes.
And that leads into someone else's question of what was the problem specifically was there a problem with New Yorkers before Andros, or was it just because that's where he had come from?
I don't, I kind of made a big deal about them being New Yorkers. There's a lot of New Englanders who are in New York, especially, as I said, in Long Island. New Englanders, like Dutch people generally, there's a lot of close connections between the Netherlands and Puritans in England. So I think what I was trying to say there is that these are people nobody knows. For the most part, the elected leaders, whether it's at the town level or at the provincial level in Massachusetts Bay or Connecticut or Plymouth or Rhode Island, these are people that are well known. They knew what their character was like. They knew what they said at town meetings. They knew the kind of principles that they lived by. There's not a lot of privacy in these towns. And I think the problem with the New Yorkers is really that they're outsiders. They have no stake. They don't have connections. They have I mean, they're going to make money and leave. It was a sense that they didn't have a stake in the common good.
Makes sense. All right. Was there the other question about the Indigenous role was someone wondering if they thought they had seen somewhere that Andros had made some movements toward returning land that was owned by English people to Indigenous people. Would that be accurate?
I mean, there might be individual circumstances. What I've realized in reading the documents of royal officials is you have to hear what they say, and then you have to look at what they do. I don't see any real consequences to Andros's, and he doesn't have a lot of time, so maybe that's unfair. But he does at various points go to the Christian Indian villages, which the Native Americans called praying villages, praying towns. And he there's some interesting conversations that take place. So actually we have indigenous Christians who talk about Andros, and actually it's indigenous Christians who report that he's allied with the French, that he's secretly encouraging the Wabanaki to revolt in their French allied attack. So I don't know. I'm actually at the moment trying to figure out how to interpret these sources and what's going on with those. Yeah, they're really fascinating. So I think I would say again, we need a whole lot more work to figure out what's going on in northern New England in this time period.
That answers someone else's question about what you might be working on next. So interesting. Records. So much to be found in records. Why did they want those records? why did Rosson get that request for the colonies records? Because they thought maybe there'd be something damning in there in the records, or simply because it was like the life story of that colony. What was the value of the records to them?
Yeah, I think all of that. Yeah. I mean, they don't say why they want the records. I'm sure that, again, Andros is competent. He just wants to know what's going on and, what decisions have been made in various, different policies that they were pursuing. But I think it's probably incriminating evidence as well. Yeah, somebody said in the chat to exert their power. Yeah, sure.
And records can be lost, which could have been bad news for the Bostonians, for the people of Massachusetts.
And for historians.
Exactly. That leads to a question I'm just going to wait one moment on. So someone was saying, Mather doesn't return with the new charter until after the Salem witch trials. You can confirm whether that data is correct, but how did the general instability and the fear and confusion around the government, the charter, the whole way of life play into the general anxiety in that society?
Ooh. Yeah, that's a tough question. I I mean, I think I'm going to go with Mike Winship's theory on this, which I think Emerson Baker and others, I don't want to speak for anybody else, but there's new work on this, which I think is really important and basically points to the fact that, there's been other witchcraft scares. There's witchcraft trials in Connecticut. There's, that this is not uncommon across Scotland and Germany and England. So there's nothing unique about witchcraft if we're talking about Salem. I think what would be the normal course of events is that the governor or whoever's in charge of a given colony would see this kind of frenzy, the growing accusations, people being scared about, what's happening with their kids or whatever, and they would nip it. They would say, no, 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 we're stopping this. The witchcraft trials in Salem happen with this new royally appointed governor, William Phips, who doesn't really know what he's doing. And he's not really initiated in a full-scale way into this political culture, and he just lets it go. He doesn't stop it, which is what governors are supposed to do. So, are there individuals to blame? Absolutely. I'm not trying to simplify things at all. But I think the fact that they just transitioned to this royally appointed governor has a lot to do with it.
Yes. I also ask a question that is interesting. I think we could say that maybe 100 years ago, historians and people in general might draw a very straight line between the Puritan founders and the Revolution.
Hmm.
And then it got a little more complex, and people were like, well, it was not a straight line, and the principles of enlightenment that the revolution was based on were unknown in the early 17th century. But now we seem to see like a very strong line between the two. So the person asks, New Englanders in the 1770s, as the revolution perhaps is approaching, how much of this history did they know? How much of a straight line was it for them? Was it more like, well, this is just our culture to resist? Or did they really know, like, no, we fight for these principles?
They knew principles. They also knew specifics. They knew these stories. And you can see it if you just read through the newspapers, which a lot of them are online now. You can read through the newspapers at the time of the Stamp Act. They are reprinting documents from these earlier constitutional crises. So we know that people had access to these these kind of stories. It's ironic, but the governor of Massachusetts, Thomas Hutchinson, who ends up he's a constitutional minded guy, but he ends up being a royalist. He's actually the one who makes a lot of these documents available to people, especially from the 17th century. But, I do think people at the time of the Revolution had an extraordinary knowledge of their own history. And I think that's especially true for New Englanders. It may be true to a certain extent of other regions as well, but New Englanders tend to be very historically minded people.
So I'm going to go back to something that you said at the beginning. I think you used this phrase, freedom of speech. what was the Puritan early mid 17th century understanding of what we would call freedom of speech? I don't believe that they used that phrase themselves, but we associate it with them. When you say people could speak at a town meeting, people were invited to comment at the synod. Can you draw that line between what they would have understood as your liberties as an individual in that colony and what we would call freedom of speech?
Yeah, you're right. They don't use the same language. I think there's a sense that broad political opinion is a good thing. They will, in town meetings, they'll fine people if they if they start shouting or start like ad hominem personal attacks. If there are boundaries to, I don't know what the right word is, maybe decorum or civility. You can't just get up there and harangue people. It's not okay. And they'll fine you for it. But other than that, I mean, I think especially in the town meetings, I mean, these people are neighbors. I think there's an extraordinary level of participation. I think people have practice speaking and developing this political culture. So yeah, I don't know. Again, I think that would be a great doctoral thesis, right? That would be a great project for somebody to take on to try and figure out what they say over time with regard to freedom of discourse, and how that's different in different colonies or different decades. Yeah, it's a great project.
We're giving people a lot of good ideas here
Yeah.
for work that they can do. And that brings up a question, like, if someone is interested in looking at these records, where can you find them? Are they online? Do you have to go to an archive or a university? Where could people get started in general?
So thankfully, we have some wonderful collections. The Colonial Society of Massachusetts has made all their collections freely available through their website. They've got some of the best documents on this time period. There's a couple of collected volumes, the Randolph papers, the Andros tracts. You can get those on archive.org or Hathi Trust, some of these nice online libraries. So yeah, actually the documents of the crisis of the 1680s, scholars, a generation ago did a great job making these available, annotating them. I mean, there's still a lot more documents in the Massachusetts archives and in the court records and that kind of thing. But I think a lot of the basic pamphlets have been made pretty easily available.
It's amazing how much has been digitized. It's pretty astounding the amount of travel you no longer have to do. And if people are thinking, oh my gosh, I didn't catch all that, this is being recorded. So the recording of this video will be up on the PHB website at historicbostons.org soon. So you can come back to this point in the video and get all of those resources that Adrian mentions. They are, anyone can just log into a lot of these different sites, especially the Mass Archives, and just start reading. Hope you have a lot of time because there are a lot of pages. Marilyn Roach does say that yes, Mather and the charter did return in late May of 1692 when the jails were already full of witch suspects. The scare had begun the winter before while waiting to see who that new governor would be and what was actually in the new charter. And I think, as you say, probably people were shocked that that new governor didn't seem to know what to do. Almost seemed like,
Thank you, Marilyn. That's a terrific
yeah,
point.
almost seemed like the religion didn't really make full sense to him. He wasn't quite sure why it was happening or how to approach it. Going back up, someone notes that I've never heard of this. After the Boston Tea Party, Benjamin Franklin played the part of Rosson when he was called to the cockpit to be chided by his betters. So again, he's very aware of it.
Great.
Or that. Born in 1705, just 20 years after all of this took place. Okay, the big question that is probably on a lot of people's minds is talking about drawing straight lines between the past and the future and the present. Um, the broad question is, how can you foster a more well-informed and public-spirited society today? Just if you could go over those building blocks again of what they would have considered to be public spiritedness, what did that mean? And what did they put in place in their society what mechanisms did they have to make it happen?
I mean, yeah, I think about this a lot. You know, it's interesting. They talk about it a lot at fast days. For the last project, I read through most of the fast day sermons from the 1660s, and this is a time when people get together and they talk about the public good and what's gone wrong and what can we do better. And of course, it's a religious context, but I think there's also political skills that are being shared even in that context. Um, and I think this also takes place in schools of various kinds and in other ways. Even the election sermons, right? People come in May, early May every year to hear the election sermon, and those are fascinating to read. They always talk about public spiritedness. What does it mean? And they go through and they say, elected leaders, this is what we want you to be thinking about. People, this is what we want you to be thinking about. They go through the different segments of society and they basically say, this is not cultivating a good society is not just the job of the leaders, it's the job of everyone, and it's going to involve sacrifice. It's hard. Free societies don't just uh continue, right? They have to be continually nourished. And so, I think this public spiritedness is really an ethic of sacrifice. It's about what is your family going to do to promote the good of your society. And I think even, on the Sabbath, people are visiting their neighbors who are having a hard time. That's what you do at the end of the Sabbath day every week. You know, go visit the widow who's struggling for firewood and make sure she has firewood. It's all these different ways that the fabric of society is built up. That's also public spiritedness.
Someone noticed that wonderful bit of a poem that was up, as we entered this, a bit of doggerel, as they called it, about the evil Edmund Randolph. And this person says, I remember reading Randolph's letter of complaint to England about this years ago when they were doing college research on the Glorious Revolution. Could you just tell us a little more about Edmund Randolph and why he got chosen to be the one to go to New England and what his brief was, what he was supposed to do, and how it worked out?
Oh my goodness. Well, I didn't talk about Randolph tonight, but yeah, he's a really ambitious guy. He really thinks that New Englanders are not loyal to the crown. He thinks they don't deserve the privilege of self-government in the way that they have it. So, he shows up in the colony in 1676 when this is an awful time of course, for Indigenous people, and also for colonists. And he starts investigating and he looks into their courts, and he's another one of these people who, if you read his writing, he looks like he's really cares about Indigenous rights, but if you watch what he does, he undermines them, right? So yeah, so he gathers all this data. He's the main person when I talked about in the late 1670s gathering incriminating data to fuel the campaign against the charter. Randolph is the one who's doing that. He gets sent back as a kind of high-level tax commissioner and to enforce the navigation acts, and he sets up this court and he tries to convict all these locals of violations of the Navigation Act. And amazingly, juries don't go along with it. I mean, imagine.
When did he leave? How long was he here? Was it about a year or was it longer than that?
I think it's longer than a year, and then he goes back and he helps with the Quo Warranto and reports to the royal officials and the Board of Trade and everything. So,
Lived a full life, never came back. He was sent as part of that committee right after King Philip's War, as you say, because that was, presented by the monarch as the last straw with New England. If we let you people basically govern yourselves and look at this horrendous war that you let happen and you almost didn't win. So we're going to come in and we're going to have to change everything and take over because you clearly can't manage it yourself. Um, what kind of impact did the war have on the people themselves? Would there have been some people in New England, some English people who would have maybe agreed with that and thought, wow, this war is a terrible judgment of God upon us. Maybe we're not doing the right thing. Maybe we do need to make big change, fundamental changes to our society.
the only people I've read who say that directly are Quakers who, in this moment, tend to be royalist. And you know, I mean, I should say this, lots of people are doing self-examination after the war. They're trying to figure out what went wrong. I mean, these practices of like that happened at the Reforming Synod, you know, what, in fact, the Reforming Synod you could see in that context of people trying to figure out what did we do wrong. Um, so yeah, I think yeah, but as far as people saying, well, the war was hard, therefore we should redesign our government, I don't know. I think Quakers are the main ones who are saying that.
Okay, which is kind of to be expected. One person, I am not going to remember the way you probably will, is asking, can you name those 5 men from Ipswich again? I am
Um,
forgetting. What specifically was that attached to?
So they're the leaders of the protest in Ipswich, where they don't want to elect a tax commissioner in 1686, and they don't want to pay taxes without, or rates as they would have called them, without representation. So the men are John Andrews, Robert Kinsman, William Goodhue, Thomas French, and the minister John Wise. And I think there's also a similar protest in Andover, and I don't have those men's names, but I mean, we don't have documents from all these places, and I haven't done the work to go into the deep, you know, local records to find them. But my understanding is these, you know, these protests against taxation without representation were pretty widespread.
And again, this is recorded, so if you didn't quite get all those names, just come back and just even move it up to this point and you can get them again. 2 final questions, I think, or we have a little time, but how do you think, speaking of straight lines and the lack of straight lines, this very politically sophisticated idea of consent to taxation from a government you elected that represents you has been transformed over the last 100 years, perhaps, into we didn't want to pay taxes. America's about not paying taxes. You see this with recent political groups, and even earlier in the 20th century. What is it about the capacity for that kind of complexity that may be missing? Was this, I mean, it's also clear in the revolution that it was taxation, no taxation without representation. Just your thoughts on how that message can get lost or changed.
Yeah, it's a fascinating question, and you know, I'm not qualified to talk about more recent events, but I would say, you know, New Englanders in the colonial period, they don't like paying taxes either. It's not like people like paying rates, and they have all kind of debates about, you know, whether the rate's going to go up a quarter percent, or, you know, they're they don't love this, but I think because there's annual elections and because the deputies are elected by the towns and they go to Boston to represent the people in the towns, you know, I just have been finding more and more in the archives that sometimes the town meetings will actually send the deputies to Boston with written instructions. Like they really expect these guys to represent their interest. And so when the rates are voted on, and you know, and there's some rates that happen at a town level and some that happen at a colony level, um, I think they have a sense that I think people they have a sense that they had a say, at least in who was making the decisions, and that matters a lot. Again, these are small communities. People know each other.
Okay. And is it Edmund Randolph someone's asking, or Edward? And now I'm doubting myself.
Edward Randall.
It was Edward. Edward. I think I may have said Edmund and led people astray. I don't know why I'm always doing that. Before he was, hounded into the harbor to the islands and then put in prison, were there other actions, unified actions, that multiple colonies who might once have been in the United Colonies of New England took to resist the Andros regime as they would have seen it?
Yes. So, I mean, I focused on the Boston story tonight, but we could also tell a very exciting story about Connecticut. And actually there's some evidence that Andros escapes and goes down to Rhode Island, and that they recapture him there. So there we could tell a version of this story for the other colonies too, and there were all kind of exciting things that happened.
So there was more general resistance. I think we have come to the end of our question. I'm going to go through and check. Someone notes that Mass Archives has the testimony of William Bond, who accused Andros of paying an indigenous person a gold ring to revolt against the colony. Maybe another example of the rumors that could easily fly.
Right.
Someone notes the work of Professor Colin Calloway at Dartmouth.
Oh, terrific. I actually have his book right here. I just read it. Again, it's a terrific book.
What's that called?
It's The Western Abenakis of Vermont. Yeah, this is essential
Okay.
reading for understanding those tribal politics in northern New England.
All right. Good. Someone brings that up. Thank you. I think we have gotten to just about everything. And I think we are going to be left thinking about what we can draw, just like people a generation later, well, a century later in the 1770s drew from this. We'll see what we can draw from it in our own lives as well. And thank you for bringing this up. And it seems like such a bombshell. You would just think that this would be something, someone said that they did learn about this, but I think the rest of us were left behind. You know, why on earth would this kind of extremely revolutionary, very iconically American story just get forgotten? I guess that can happen with many things in history. All right. Thank you so much, Adrian. I'm going to remind everyone the talk will be available on the website, the recording. Thanks so much for spending time with us. And I'll just give you a little preview of our next talk, which will be on May 22nd. And that will be with Dr. Francis Bremer, talking about even what happened before the 1660s and 80s, like going all the way back to the first English people called Puritans who came to this place. A tradition of resistance, the Puritan prequel. And it's really about, again, where did that concept of self-government that seemed to have no strong, clear precedent in the society they came from, where did that come from for the people who came to this place, the Puritans? So you can sign up at the website, historicbostons.org, as usual. I'm also about to put a link into the chat. Let me see if I can grab it. This is the survey form that you can fill out to give us your thoughts about tonight's presentation. So if you want to grab that Google link, you can go ahead and get into the survey. I think you can also find it through the website again, historicbostons.org, to find all of our events and all of the things that we have going on. And you can always donate at the website if you like. And I think that we have a QR code also right there that you can scan to donate as well. So thank you everyone for having such great questions and comments. We're going to leave this screen up for a little while so you can get to the QR code if you like. We appreciate you being here and your engagement. And it's good to know that so many people are so interested in this very valuable history for what it means in the past and what it means today. So thank you everyone, and good night.